here's our agenda for today. We'll first have an extended welcome from Dr. Pasquet. Then I'll do some housekeeping, just letting you know kind of how we run QualLab lunches. I'll introduce our wonderful guest speaker, and then we'll have an opportunity to learn from the brilliance of Dr. Mac. After her lecture, we will have a Q&A where you will have the opportunity to ask questions either directly or through the chat. As we close today's QualLab lunch, we will offer I'll offer some more information about how you can get involved with future lunches, and also let you know how you can connect with the QualLab both in person and online.
The QualLab is a research methodology center with a fabulous team. This is a team that is intergenerational and built on the work that of previous GRAs and the current GRAs and undergraduate that work with us are listed here, as well as Dr. Rhodesia McMillian. I encourage you to take a look at the dashboard of resources that's up online, some of the work that we've done and tried to put up there as a way of making accessible some of the work that we've done here, and as a small team, and putting it out to everyone. If you're in the College of Education and Human Ecology, we do have consultations for one-on-ones where we'll sit with you and try to think through research designs, because one of the things that we really think about is people purport equity and justice, and these are important topics. What are the ways in which this shows up for you in your research designs, throughout your research designs, with the theories, with the methodologies, with the methods, collection, thinking with communities for questions, and also dissemination, where your work is going. And it's a ripple effect and a community kind of work when you engage in scholarship of this sort. So this is a little bit about the QualLab, and I just really appreciate the group that's here that has worked so hard on a regular daily basis to provide things like this here for you today. So with that, I'm going to shoot it back to Shay.
Thank you so much. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. So while the lunch is happening, please turn off your microphone unless you want to raise a question to Dr. Mac during the Q&A portion. You can also share questions, affirmations, comments in the chat space throughout their presentation and or during the Q&A. This session is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the QualLab website and on our YouTube channel within 1 week after the session. Closed captioning is provided during the session. You can access it by clicking live transcript on the lower right corner of your own video box. Please feel free to turn it on and off. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jacqueline Mac. Dr. Mac is an assistant professor of higher education and student affairs at Northern Illinois University. She is one of the co-founders of the SEAAster Scholars Collective, which is committed to advancing knowledge and understanding of the educational experiences of Southeast Asian American students, staff, and faculty. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mac. The floor is now yours.
Things look good. Okay. I'm really excited to be here with everybody. I would like to first start off with a land and labor acknowledgement. So I'm connecting with you all today from the lands of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Sauk and Meskwaki, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux peoples. These are the peoples who've lived and shepherded the land that is now considered DeKalb, Illinois. And further, it's important for me to also name that enslaved people who are primarily indigenous and of African descent provided exploited labor throughout Illinois to build what we consider the state of Illinois today. It is also particularly important for me as a daughter of refugees to acknowledge this land and labor. As a daughter of refugees, although my ancestors and parents and family members were displaced, I'm recognizing that I too am a settler. And so I am complicit in the ongoing land theft and displacement and erasure of indigenous peoples. And most recently, some of the ways that I've been really thinking about grappling with living in what's being called to me is really unearthing and articulating the way that violence connection, the way that violence and war and imperialism is really deeply connected, and how war and violence really hurts all people, but it bears a particular consequence on certain folks and not always others. And so I think about what is lost, what is unsaid, what is hidden and masked. And you'll see lots of these elements in how I talk about critical refugee feminist epistemology, but also in some of the works that the SEAAster scholars have done. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about and name and invoke the rest of the SEAAster Scholars Collective, because we are indeed a collective. It is not just me doing this work. In fact, if it were just me, I don't think that this work would even be imagined, like it wouldn't even be possible. So it's really part of the collective that I and others are able to do this type of work. And so I want to recognize that our collective is comprised of Dr. Malpan Pomasa, who is at UC Santa Barbara, future Dr. Vanessa Sovanika Na, Dr. Varaxi Yi at CSU Fresno, California State University Fresno, my apologies, Dr. Davorn Sisavat, who's at California State University Fullerton, our newest doctor, Dr. Linda Peng, who's at University of Pennsylvania, future Doctora Latina Gaviset. And so the flow of my talk with everyone is going to cover these three areas today. I'm going to start by discussing some of the foundations of refugee feminist epistemology, and then share examples of how we enacted this epistemology through a few works that the SEAAster Scholars Collective has worked on in the past and is currently working on, and then wrap up with some possibilities of how this epistemology can really inform qualitative inquiry in the future. And so some foundations, and I think it's important for me to kind of name that adding or not including the word critical in front of refugee feminist epistemology, adding it seems a little redundant. And as I talk about refugee feminist epistemology and its foundations and then how we use it, it's redundant in that this criticality is actually already woven in throughout. And so there's not necessarily a need to say critical, but you can if you want to. And so I'll start talking about where this epistemology emerged from. And I want to name that the SEAAster Scholars Collective. We're not the originators of this work. We're pulling heavily from other folks who've theorized and conceptualized this, and you'll see some of those folks invoked in a few slides from this particular slide. But it really emerged from a desire to move away from the media narratives and conceptualization of refugees, refugee displacement, and therefore refugeehood as tragic, as victims of violence, towards seeing refugee displacement as reproducers of social innovations. It's also a movement away from thinking about refugee-ness as political and historical positions. Right, so a lot of times we have this suspended understanding that refugees are these brown folks coming off of airplanes, or they're boat people, and they're in need of saving and in need of rescue, and it's a political category as well. It's a movement away from those positions, not eliminating that's kind of some of the experiences, but towards a theoretical position. And Dr. Yvonne Kwan says this and captures the spirit of re-envisioning refugee and refugee-ness way better than I could actually articulate. And so she writes that, you know, part of this epistemology is really understanding the experiences of living in refuge, experiences of living in refuge, that those experiences transcend reductionist notions of what I mentioned earlier, of violence, as a rescue, and instead points to different modes of a negotiation and imagination. And so Dr. Lila Sharif, who's at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, describes a feminist refugee epistemology as essentially naming the affective and material non-endings and afterlives of colonial imperial wars in refugee terms, as well as foregrounding the polyolithic subjectivities that constitute refugee lives. In her work, she describes non-endings as the ongoingness of colonial and imperial wars, because the impacts of war don't just end when a conflict, quote unquote, ends, but that there are elements of these wars that extend beyond those times or kind of markers of ending. And that afterlives are actually mutations of these non-endings in the present moment. And so refugee feminist epistemology focuses on a couple different things. It, as I mentioned, critiques imperialism, settler colonialism and colonialism, as well as patriarchy. So those are kind of some of the theoretical academic foundations of this epistemology. Recognizing that refugee displacement is a site of social reproduction and innovation by focusing on life-making processes, and does so by embodying the complexities and contradictions of family histories, trauma, and refuginess. And as Dr. Kwan writes, it really helps us envision what could have been, because the sense of what could have been is really strong, particularly among the subsequent generations. So not just the individuals who experienced displacement, experienced war, but their descendants in their future generations, that it opens the present into the past and allows for an imagining of a different future, and one that isn't wholly shaped or defined by pain and suffering, which is one particular story of refugeehood and refuginess. And recognizing that this imagination can sometimes replicate and reproduce some of the challenges within the community, but other times it could really provide a foundation for community engagement and bonding over those affects. These are the elements of feminist refugee epistemology. Sometimes you'll see it feminist refugee epistemology, sometimes you'll see refugee feminist epistemology. There isn't necessarily a distinction as I understand it. And so the gray orbs, I suppose, is what are the elements that feminist refugee epistemology tends to. So I'll start from the top left, emotions. It tends to affects and emotions. It helps us unveil the convergences and disconnections between private grief and public commemoration, while locating and sometimes surfacing unsaid things, and illuminates the hidden, or sometimes not hidden, political forces laden with an intimate and familial interactions. Intending to these elements, feminist refugee epistemology really crosses two key dimensions. It crosses a spatial dimension, where that space is not just the physical space, but the lived practices within that space, which includes linguistic and symbolic landscapes of that space. In the linguistic and symbolic landscapes, that's where we find memories, that's where we find historical legacies, and those can be surfaced and discussed and accessed by the spatial dimension. Feminist refugee epistemology also crosses through the temporal dimension, where time is continually unsettled and remade by refugees because of this act of pulling from memory and history, recalling memory and history, both what's recalled and what can be imagined if there isn't one that's accessible, and pulls these and intertwines them with the present moment, as well as dreams of the future. And so for folks who are wondering, well, what can this epistemology help us do? What can it help us illuminate actually? I'm going to share a few examples from the work of the SEAAster Scholars Collective. And I'm going to share two works. One of them is a piece that we've completed and is out there for you all to dive in and engage with. And there's a piece that we've been working on. It's a little bit a piece that we're still tangling with. And so I'd appreciate anyone who's got thoughts and questions to help us continue tangling and untangling with that. So the first project I want to talk about is titled Voicing Names and Naming Voices, Reclamation by Southeast Asian American Women in Higher Education. It is a chapter that a few of the SEAAsters worked on and contributed to a text. I forgot the name of the text just off the top of my head right now, but I know that it's going to be shared at the end. And in this particular piece, it was, I think the text overall was about the politics and importance of names within higher education. And Vanessa, Latina, and Varaxi worked on this chapter, and they used collaborative autoethnography foregrounded by intersectionality theory to illuminate how institutional racism and sexism reproduces racialized and sexualized experiences related to our names. And this is another way that I'll invoke my SEAAsters here. You'll see their voices via these projects, since they're not able to be a part of this talk today. And so I'm going to share a quote and then kind of talk a little bit about kind of what feminist refugee epistemology allows us to pull out from this quote that I think if we use a different epistemology, or if we engaged in a different epistemology, we wouldn't really be able to get the same type of insight. And so here, this is a quote from the chapter where Varaxi is reflecting on her name. And she writes, "I think about moments of people believing they had more ownership over my name than I did, the hoops I jumped through to make my name easier. My family certainly does not pronounce my name the way I say it in the classroom or in social interactions. I am constantly reflecting, am I doing myself a disservice by Americanizing my name? No. It is not a disservice to preserve my name and to only keep the beauty of its appropriate pronunciation in my family. It is not something I'm willing to share yet because the world does not yet see me fully." What a feminist refugee epistemology allowed us to do, and really Varaxi, Latina, and Vanessa for this piece of work, was really surface familial interactions, naming what's intimate and what's happening in private, and then reclaiming this action as intimate and not knowable, and others not allowed to partake in ways that I think sometimes feels like, as a qualitative researcher, a way of reclaiming power and enacting agency that really pushes against kind of this neoliberal capitalist kind of trauma-based approach that we face within academia. Said differently, by focusing on the intimate, the familial interactions, and then deciding to keep it intimate is an act of agency and is an act of innovation within the space we occupy and take up within the academy. And here, some context related to Latina's story. And so she's sharing kind of her relationship with her names. And she talks about and describes common interactions that she's had whenever anyone asks her to introduce herself or asks her what her name is. And oftentimes there's a litany of back and forth questions and comments. And we're thinking about those interactions, Latina's recalls. The comments and questions have become a burden as I can no longer say my name and move on. I have to linger in a moment of discomfort as my anxiety builds to answer their questions. In their struggle to say my name, they care so much about making sure that they know how to say it right. They do not see the impact it has on me. The labor to make sure they say it correctly and that they feel good about it. During these interactions, I feel as if there's a magnifying glass on me. And when that feeling is gone, a sense of invisibility rushes over me. With an epistemology that pays attention to affect, that pays attention to what's not said in even said and voiced interactions, we're able to really dive underneath the surface and get a sense of what's actually emerging for Latina, and not just recalling an interaction related to our names, but really what are the kind of background dimensions and thoughts and feelings that are happening, and how that helps us more sharply understand the way that her experiences have been racialized and sexualized. My third example from this piece is from Vanessa, and she ends her reflection with this. I end this piece with my chosen and gifted name, Vanessa Sovanika Na. Vanessa as my protection and survival spell. Sovanika as a gift from my ancestors, and Na as a reminder of the lineage of matriarchs who light my way time and time again. I carry them with me always, my apologies. Here again, what is unsaid is highlighted when she says her names. And it draws across the temporal dimensions, as I mentioned earlier, right? The linguistic and the symbolic. So we see the symbolicness from the protection and survival spell that her first name, gifted by her mother, provides. Her middle name was gifted by her grandfather, who is now an ancestor. And Na is her mother's surname, and her grandmother's surname, I believe, as well. And so by landing on I carry them with me always, you see the multiple kind of planes that are being evoked and invoked when when Vanessa thinks about her name and when she says her name to others. And again, some of these stories would not be surfaced, we would not be able to access them without really understanding how these temporal components, the emotions and affects that are important in refugee life making, if we weren't using this type of epistemology, we wouldn't be able to access and center these ways of being that have been key to not only their survival of refugees, but also their ability to thrive. And it is this tension of survival and thriving that we, as a collective, landed on the project that I am calling like we're tangling with it still. And that project is the Seeking Home in Its Absence, which is a collaborative autoethnography of Southeast Asian American women. And what we're tangling with is this concept of home. Both spatial and temporal dimensions, but seeking home as a form of survival, but also seeking home and building home, homemaking as an opportunity for us to thrive. And I'll also invoke my SEAAster Scholars members by sharing their voices with us. So one of the memories and one of the reflections that Malapon shared with us was really about the number of homes that she thinks about when she thinks of home. So she writes, after arriving at Camp Pendleton, my family resettled in Santa Ana. Situated in northern Orange County, Santa Ana is an ethnically diverse working class community. My earliest memories are tied to Santa Ana. Growing up in a 3-bedroom home with 14 other family members, riding on the public bus to collect cans with my grandma, and climbing fences to play at the junior high behind our home. Erasing Santa Ana as home would mean erasing the struggle, work, and sacrifices of my family. And so although her and her family moved to another city several years later, Malapon really expressed the importance of retaining her connection to her first home, which symbolized her family's earliest efforts to make a life in the United States. And it's through her reflection and sharing that we were able to see the commonality and convergences of all of our stories, of our homes during our upbringing, organized chaos, constant movements, a sense of warmth, the presence of delicious food. And so in this example, we're really able to see how memory is very much present within the lives of the Southeast Asian American women in this study. We're also able to see the political forces that have shaped some of these private everyday interactions. we're not naming specific political forces, we're not naming specific policies, but some of these are invoked in the recollection of these interwoven memories of a particular place in time and in our memories as well. Devorn's reflection really, I think, evokes what Dr. Kwan was saying, the sense of what could have been, being really strong in the future generations of folks who have this refugee experience. And Devorn writes, especially with the way in which my parents have tried to construct home and the sense of displacement and settledness, is this idea of belonging. And so for them, belonging was always having a solid family, the sense of family. And even with grad school or even after grad school, I consider home not so much as the structure, but more as a concept and as a desire of belonging, of creating a community. And so we start seeing the tensions, we start seeing the tangling of home to survive after displacement, but also creating a home that is more than just surviving. And Linda provides this reflection that I think really gets us towards some of where our work is now, which is related to life making and homemaking. So she writes, when you have this history in your family and experience within it, because I know what it's like to move alone and have to find and build my own community and to make my own home forever how long it will be, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. I need to be very clear about what is necessary and what is not. And what I have always noticed is that whatever my physical belongings are, my friends from different corners of the world and the US will always come to visit me. And so then I know who's also a part of my family, who's worth really keeping in my life and the connections I have with them. And I really want to highlight the displacement, chosen or forced displacement of academia, where there's a lot of movement from graduate school, postdocs, then moving into visiting or clinical or faculty positions or instructor positions. All of those moments feel familiar to us as descendants of refugees and refugees ourselves. But it's being leveraged as a strength here and as a way to envision what home could really be like for folks who experience displacement in this way. So it's not just thinking about how do we move, but how do we build and root for however long that is. So it really kind of takes this very Americanized notion of a forever home or of seeding and building roots, takes it very differently for us, and really gets us towards how do we engage in making a home or homemaking, therefore life making, as a continual process. And so I want to start turning towards the possibilities of a refugee feminist epistemology for qualitative inquiry. Some of this is work that SEAAster scholars are currently working on, and others are just things that I'm like, oh, this would be really exciting to see how we can continue to expand and explore different ways of doing qualitative work. And this is really centered on this idea of life making, right? Really moving away from, moving away from this story of violence and tragedy, but towards life making, the process of life making, the possibilities of life making, all the while maintaining a finger on, a pulse on, an intuitive connection to memory, legacy, lineage, to a physical place perhaps in our mind that no longer exists in the present time. And so some of the things that I think really is possible for us is recently the SEAAster Scholars have been using our homemaking theorizing to host healing workshops for students who may identify as first generation, from refugee backgrounds, students of color, students from marginalized backgrounds who've never really felt that the Academy is for them. And we've also partnered with community-based organizations to use a refugee feminist epistemology to inform inquiry based projects about Southeast Asian American communities. And by using this epistemology, having created stronger and more aligned types of projects that will hopefully help support our community members. Some other things that I think are possible is, given that a feminist refugee epistemology crosses both spatial and temporal dimensions, and it pulls in the politics of everyday living, as well as the political, the past political forces, is the possibility of using intergenerational storytelling as a method. And while we haven't, as SEAAster Scholars, tackled this yet, we have it on our list of projects to do when we, at least I know, I'll speak for myself, when I feel emotionally at a place like I could tackle and open up that intergenerational storytelling box. But in the meantime, I am very inspired by other folks who maybe not necessarily uses a refugee feminist epistemology, but are pulling and leveraging similar components, right, of the dimensions or the elements of a refugee feminist epistemology. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, who's at Virginia Tech, I believe, in their American Studies department, I think. Don't quote me, but I guess I'm being recorded, so someone tell me if I'm wrong. She's an artist, activist, and scholar who recently used intergenerational storytelling as a method with her father to have that be used as a lens to examine a particular political period in history, but recognizing that our bodies continue to experience war afterwards. A feminist refugee epistemology also opens up the possibilities of art-based scholarly work. And I'm not saying that art-based scholarly work has not existed. It absolutely has, and there's some really wonderful examples and liberating examples of this work already. But what combined with a feminist refugee epistemology, not only can the disruption of power between the knower and seeker continues to be disrupted, but the spatial and temporal dimensions I mentioned earlier can be even more powerful. We oftentimes in the SEAAster Scholars Collective talk about the limitations of the English language, but also for me, my limitation of my proficiency of the language that I was raised with and grew up with. And so using artifacts, or other creative methods can really leverage, in partnership with a feminist refugee epistemology, can really produce powerful qualitative inquiry, and with the possibilities of not just reflection, but healing. My last example of kind of possibilities in life making is that there are emerging Southeast Asian American based epistemologies that might not necessarily call feminist refugee epistemologies like their epistemological lineage, but in rethinking, revisioning what refugeehood and refuginess is, it can also provide additional ways of knowing and doing. And so an example is recently is Dr. Rikan Vu and Dr. Kaozang Moavangsu recently published a piece, a powerful stirring piece titled "Calling Our Souls Home, a Hmong Epistemology for Creating New Narratives." And I know that there are a few other, not only SEAAster scholars, but other folks within and across higher education who connect with a refugee background, who are centering and leveraging these epistemologies. And so with that, I would love to engage in a conversation with everyone. I've shared a couple ways to connect with the SEAAster Scholars Collective. And we aren't on X, but we are on Instagram, and We have an email. So with that, I'd love to hear what y'all have to say and what your thoughts are.
To unmute myself. I was just going to say thank you so much for that. I am sure that there are tons of questions. I have tons of questions. I just so appreciated you sharing not only your own work, but also the work of folks in the collective and their just journeys and ways of meaning making and sense making. And so with that, if you have a question for Dr. Mac, feel free to type it in the chat and our team can surface it for you, or in this space, feel free also to come off mute and just ask it yourself. I see a hand raised. You can go ahead.
Dr. Mac, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I'm currently, this is like a selfish kind of question, because I'm currently working on a piece that is like a reflection on using these type of like really culturally embedded like epistemologies in our work. And I am citing y'all in this work. And so my question for you is like, what is like the soul giving part of this type of work for you in crafting out this space and really, you know, like really leaning into it? And how does that like feel for you, especially navigating like the academy doing this type of work?
I love that question, Dr. Palmer. I think you asked how I feel. You asked about feelings, and
yes.
So this is interesting. I have a few SEAAster scholars I think who are on right now. The interesting, so I have two different responses. I'll have like the kind of like academic-y response and then like the feelings response. The academic-y response was like, across the projects, there are moments in our process and working together where like, we didn't talk about feelings. Or like we're writing our reflections in very academic ways, or like, you know, like we've been trained so well as an academic that it was hard to access the points that we were so inspired by in this epistemology, the affect parts, the emotions part, the memory part, the what's unsaid part. And so we've really had to work on disrupting that when we are doing our work, and the disruption is at the individual level and the collective level. Individually, I know I personally kind of go through and scan like what did I not say? What did I avoid? Or sometimes it's even, I can't even do this on a Word document. I need to do this in a different medium so that I can really kind of remove myself from academia. Because I've now trained myself to think that every time a Word document opens, it is academia. But collectively, I think, because we're doing this work together, and you saw that a favorite of ours is the collaborative autoethnography, is that part of the data collection is also the data analysis part, right? So we're able to engage in our individual reflection, read each other's reflections, come together and talk about it, and then also be like, okay, well, none of us talked about this, so let's talk about the thing we didn't talk about right now. And so I think that also, on one hand, gives us some permission to just kind of show up as we are, and also very gently and lovingly turn the mirror on ourselves and go, okay, let's do this differently. But in terms of feelings, like I think what spurred the homemaking project was like the space we were cultivating together was so unlike any other space we've experienced before. And at the time, I didn't share kind of the origin stories of SEAAster Scholars because I know we had limited time, but there's a piece that will be shared later about that we published about kind of how we came together and why we've chosen this particular epistemology to inform our work, even if we don't say it's exactly informing our work and the piece that we've published, is that this is the place that feels like home to us. And what is so unique and special about it is that we can have, you know, academic-y conversations where we don't talk about feelings and then shift really quickly into talking about feelings, but then also talk about why we weren't able to talk about our feelings. And that kind of like, I don't know how to describe it, right? But it's this weaving that's smooth and not forced. And it just feels like we're seen without having to explain and without having to ask. And so I think that's where the soul giving part is, because nearly all other spaces we were in, there's always some explanation that one or all of us have to do. And in our space, we don't necessarily have to. And that just feels real good on the soul. It feels real good. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Quickly, there is a follow-up to that question. I think that you've answered it a bit, but I want to acknowledge Chelsea Smith's question in the chat that just says, how do you all take care of yourselves and each other doing this very important but soul-stirring work?
Yeah. Where I think when we engage with each other, it is caring. It is a type of care for each other. Like I think that space, and there's a couple other one other space I'm thinking about, but that space in particular, like almost we just kind of naturally, I don't know if it's natural. I don't know how I'm describing it, but at the middle or end or even beginning of every conversation we have, whether it's we're working on a project or we're checking in with each other, there's always a naming of our appreciation for each other. And it's a virtual version of taking each other out for coffee and just going on a walk together. Because none of us are located in the same place, and some of us haven't necessarily met each other in person. So it's very much an affect and emotion that kind of gets stirred whenever we get together. But I also think like there's a power in a collective. I'll share a really quick story. I know we've got more questions, but we had a piece under review that we received really interesting and problematic, to be honest, types of feedback. And we each individually kind of sort of thought, we were initially enraged, and then we're like, okay, maybe there's something here that we're not thinking about. But then we realized we were all enraged by it. And so we're like, well, that's a feeling that's not just like, oh, someone's critiquing our work, but someone's really trying to make our work fit something else. And so we just collectively decided to pull it. And I don't know that I would have done that. I don't know that I would have done it so quickly. I don't know that I would have done it. I don't know that I would have done it had it not been for the collective. So I think there's an empowering component when we see each other and can hold each other up, but also really like reinforce the importance of our work and keeping that integrity there. We also do send each other a lot of stuff, like foods and snacks and all that. So there's a lot of celebrations that we embed in between. Thanks.
Wonderful. Dr. Hutchings, I think, has a hand raised for a question.
Hi, Dr. Mac. It's always
Hi,
good
Dr. Hutchings.
it's always good to see you. And thank you for the space. That was actually my question I was going to ask, particularly in ways of how this work it's from what you've shared and these reflections, it's just so life-giving and such a space at home. But when you go through the journal review process, it feels like being not in a space of a home, and it feels like being in an unfamiliar town or unfamiliar space. And so I was just similar to you. I was just also curious about, you already kind of shared about the journal review process, but is there spaces where you all feel like where your work should be shared that's not in an academic space? So like, is there other outlets that you want to feel that you don't have to necessarily go through this identification of like this sense of like sisterhood and a sense of connectedness and this love that you all have in the work where it gets somewhat corroded or shrouded, particularly from the academic journal review process. So it's just kind of curious about maybe some other outlets that will feel more fulfilling from the way that you've also already curated and cultivated those spaces.
Yeah, I love that question because I think because so our collective primarily like prioritizes like our relationship and our community and our connections first, and we're also not like idealistic and or naive in thinking that like, oh, Jackie's going up for her third year review, or like, you know, Roxy is first going up for tenure and promotion, you know. So like, I think there's some practical things that we keep in mind, but I think we keep that in mind and we prioritize our relationships first. It also, I think it frees us from having to submit to certain journals or certain outlets. I think because this work is so personal, we then see other ways of carrying that work out. And so I think that's opened us up to journals in different fields. So I think there's a lot of like straddling of higher education work that we do with other like Asian American studies, ethnic studies, American studies, feminist studies spaces that I think not only are more welcoming of our work, but also like pushes us to think about our work differently too. And I think the practical side is also like, we also know in our bones when we host a webinar or a workshop, and there are students who may have never met each other, but are saying like, this space was what I needed because it's just been so rough everywhere else. We know that there's something important about what we're doing. Life-giving space, you know, whatever that word is, whatever adjective is. And so I think we're less likely to go to you know, publication journals or submit grants to places that we've kind of heard they're just not friendly. So we're like, okay, we're gonna figure out how, and this is very like refugee of us to be like, how do we figure out among the resources that we have to help our project work, to help make our project continue, to help fund the project, to make sure, you know, someone is, you know, if someone has a heavy teaching load, is there a grant we can apply for that's a course, you know. So it's very much we're leaning into the refugee-ness to make this work, but also I think continue to be grounded in community, because I think I think once we see that there's so much that this work can do within and outside the academy, that also means it doesn't have to live or die in the academy. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Makes perfect sense. I just, there's always an all by you and the work that you do. So just wanted to also give you love. You know, love you, appreciate you very much.
I'm going to jump in and ask a question. And it's a question related to autoethnography. And I think, you know, as graduate students and early career scholars, we're often told as people of color that autoethnography is not as rigorous or as should not be used before, you know, like before you get tenure, before you get a position. And so I just wondered what advice you would offer to younger scholars about pushing back against that and kind of like doing what you think is best as far as methodology.
I will say, I mean, like I have like my initial responses that I have, and I think that type of messaging can be really harmful and damaging, because there's the way that there are strengths and limitations to any methodology, there are strengths and limitations to collaborative autoethnography. And I think a lot about, you know, when we think about research design, the alignment of epistemology and methodology is so important, not just because it needs to be aligned, but because what is centered, what is foregrounded is going to look so different depending on the methodologies. And so we have found that a collaborative autoethnography with our feminist refugee epistemology makes a lot of sense, because it allows us to tap into what is intuitively known within us as participants and within us as scholars. And so I think that we've continued to refine how we engage in collaborative autoethnography over the years, in that I think at the beginning we were trying to follow a structure because that's what we're told. There needs to be a structure, and to some extent, yes, there needs to kind of be some guidance in how we're doing this. But we realized some of it was being forced by, like, we need to adhere to this academic standard and what rigor looks like. And so I think folks who are interested in doing collaborative autoethnography is, and you're probably already doing this, right? Making the case for why this methodology allows us to tell a different story about the thing that we're interested in. And the thing that oftentimes, right, probably gets masked, gets discarded, gets disregarded. And the pushback isn't always because your work and your idea isn't the thing that it's not about you. It's really about the person who's asking the question and providing the advice, who's like, I think sometimes, especially if it's a trusted advisor, they might be coming from a place of, how do I set you up for success? And that's a lot of stuff that we talk about related to our families, right? I think I didn't dive into it, but in Vanessa's reflection on the project about naming, she talks about how, like, her mom gave her an American name that's easy to spell, that doesn't sound any bit Khmer, because she wanted to protect her daughter, right? So I think, like, that type of understanding also helps us as a collective understand that when we do get pushback about it, particularly from people that, from advisors and mentors, it's not about disregarding our work, but really about a form of protection. And so I think it's hard to really, contextualize without going deeper. If it's a journal article, if it's a journal peer review piece coming back, like if it's a mass review, I think, like, it's hard to really have those individuals surface what they're trying to say when they're saying, hey, maybe try a different approach. But if it's a trusted person, I think what we've learned a lot through employing collaborative ethnography, but using this epistemology, is like, let's probe a little bit deeper about what's inside. And maybe there are new possibilities of what we can do.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think we have time for one more question in the space, and so feel free to unmute or put your question in the chat.
So could you talk, so much of this is about collaboration, community, working with, being in space with, and the humanness of the work that you're doing. And I appreciate what you said about how that's not always how we're taught or trained in the academy, and the ways to push on that, and with journal publications and everything. Could you talk about how, Shay mentioned a number of people are grad students. How did you, or do you go about creating the group? How do you find each other? What kind of advice can you give for scholars at any point in their career about being in space with?
Yeah. Some of our origin stories as a collective was it's very much like, as I think about it, I was like, oh, this is very like immigrant refugee, like how we even came together. Like, one of us had a friend who was like, oh, I know someone else who's doing something that might be interested. Like, you two should meet. And then those two met and were like, oh, wow, another one of you exists. And we kind of had like those light bulb moments, like, and I think it became like okay, which conference are you doing next? Like, let's connect there. And then I think recognizing, one, that we just needed to see each other, right? Because we're like, okay, there's another person who's trying to do what I'm going to do. And very many of us have at least Southeast Asian stuff in our kind of overall research umbrella. And so there was a shared interest, but also then what was clear, a shared experience of, oh, we're often one of the only, or we're often asked, why does it matter to study Southeast Asian Americans? Or there's so few of you, or like, why does it, like, you know, so I think we started connecting on those. And then as we were talking, we were like, how do we innovatively use our connection as a point of scholarship too? And it was really, it actually kind of came out like, we're also, quite a few of us are also like eldest children or like first daughters or eldest daughters. So there's a tenacity where we're like, we can't keep going to these conferences and there being nothing about Southeast Asian Americans. And so we took it upon ourselves to like be like, well, let's do this together. And I think that really helped lay a lot of the foundation of, okay, like we can do this because we want to do it for ourselves. But then we realized in doing that, we were then making a space to connect with other Southeast Asian American scholars who were looking possibly for that same space or found some resonance with something that we were doing, and then maybe did something on their own too. And so I think like there's a lot of pressure in the academy, and there was a lot of pressure we were feeling and still feel to some extent, right? Of like, we need to be doing, you know, scholarship and all this other stuff. And it's like, when I realize I get often tired about how long the journey is. And we know the academy doesn't love us and wasn't meant for a lot of us. And so if we were thinking about, if we accept that truth, then we need to take an active role in constructing the spaces for us. And then for those of us who are moving through, right, we're at this point, I'm done with graduate school, I'm a faculty member, I'm a tenure track faculty member. How am I then trying to create some of these spaces? Because I then feel like I have a responsibility to connect with folks who are graduate students and providing a space to do scholarship that's not always informed by this very like neoliberal academic capitalism type way. And I see at least one of you on this call. So, you know, so I think that that's kind of how we've been doing it. And that's, I think, like, I joke a lot. I don't joke a lot, but it's true. Like, I was like, if we could get collective promotion and tenure, like I would be getting promotion tenure, not because it's me, Jacqueline Mac, doing this stuff. It's because it's me in relation to and connection with all these other really brilliant people who care about me and care about the work and care about humanizing the academy. That's how I would have gotten promotion and tenure. It's not because it's just, you know, me and myself. So when you find your people who believe that too, like those are the people that we keep and maintain our relationships with.
Thank you so much. Once again, we just want to thank you for being here and doing this QualLab lunch. I'm going to share my screen one more time to close us out. Let's make it. All right. So you can learn more from the SEAAster Scholars Collective. There are a number of articles on the screen, articles and chapters. And so I think all of these, I want to say all of them were mentioned by Dr. Mac throughout their presentation. And so there is an article in the Journal of Southeast Asian American Education and Advancement, the SEAAster Scholars Collective, A Story of Homemaking in Academia. There's also one in the New Directions for Higher Education, Refugee Life Making, Recentering the Refugee Narrative Through Feminist Refugee Epistemology. And then also 2 chapters, one coming out just next month. And so we'll also link these on our website so that you can also easily access them when we put out the recording of this lecture. With that, we invite you also to join us next time. So our next QualLab lunch is in January with Dr. Harper Keenan, who is out of the University of British Columbia, talking about his work with transing methodologies. And then we also want to say thank you to everyone who shows up to the QualLab lunch, who watches on YouTube, and who just continues to engage with our work here. So feel free to visit our website, follow us on Twitter or X, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Always, you can email us to schedule a consultation or just give us your feedback, ask a question. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. That was so great. The comments were just, it was really powerful work.
Thank you.
Glad to see the publication.